A few months ago, I found a book in our local charity shop called Why Love Matters. It's subtitled How Affection Shapes a Baby's Brain. It's a book that explains why love is essential to the development of a baby's brain in the earliest years of life, and how early interactions between babies and adults have lasting consequences, both for good and unfortunately also for ill. It's not only a baby's brain that is shaped by their relationships with adults and their primary caregivers, but also the baby's entire nervous system. Those babies that receive an abundance of love, affection, care, and nurture in these earliest years of their development are able to develop neural pathways in their brains that help them to blossom and grow in ways of greater wholeness and stability of character. Whereas those babies that don't receive consistent love and affection, or may even be neglected, are more likely to struggle later on in life with dealing with stress, self-esteem, and are also more susceptible later in life to struggle with things like anorexia, addiction, and antisocial behavior. What interests me about the book, written by Sue Gerhardt, who's a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in the UK, is that in a very real sense it provides secular and scientific backing for the most central important value in Christianity, namely love. Christianity can't be all that wrong. When asked about the most important commandment, Jesus in effect emphasizes the word love 3 times. The third time is implicit within the statement, love your neighbor as yourself. In Luke's version, the word love is only explicitly used once, but it is clearly emphasized in 3 directions. Love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself. This is Annie. She's getting quite playful. In John's Gospel, chapter 13, John's Gospel is the only Gospel not to include the greatest commandment, but in its place, John's Gospel has the new commandment, where Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." And in this commandment, the word love is explicitly repeated 3 times. And in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul, who had once been a religious extremist before his encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, comes to the conclusion that there is in fact nothing greater than love. Faith, hope, and love remains. He ends his beautiful hymn to love, but the greatest of these, he says, is love. Roughly 2,000 years later, Sue Gerhardt provides psychological and scientific backing to the claim that love is of utmost importance. The greatest is love in the healthy development of a child's brain and nervous system, and by implication their development as fully rounded and balanced human beings. Indeed, the root cause of many of our struggles is in fact that many of us do not know ourselves to be deeply valuable and valued. Over the weekend, Wendy and I watched the 2019 hit film Rocket Man, which is a portrayal of the early life of Elton John up to the point where he goes into therapy for his addictions to alcohol and drugs. His was a story of a home life with very little real love, affection, and affirmation, apart from the love shown him by his grandmother, who was the one who paid for his lessons on the piano. He longed to be hugged by his dad, who was cold and aloof, angry, and who ended up abandoning Elton John as a child, getting married to someone else and having other children that he loved more clearly than Elton. But Elton John's mother was not much better, As she is portrayed in the film, she was preoccupied with herself, and so had very little warmth and love and encouragement to give to the little Elton. Elton John's descent into drugs and alcohol and a wild life was clearly an attempt to fill the enormous hole that should have been filled with the love, kindness, affection, and affirmation of his parents in his earliest years as a child. It is interesting that the key moment of transformation and spiritual awakening in Jesus' life, and which propelled him into ministry, was at his baptism. We have in the Gospels, what we have in the Gospels is clearly a symbolic representation of an experience that was clearly difficult to put into human words. But the culmination of that baptism story reveals that in that experience was the profound and life-changing affirmation that he was God's beloved. You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased, are the words in Mark's Gospel. This experience of being bathed in divine love in the Jordan River propelled Jesus into a whole new direction, with his primary purpose in life now proclaiming in word and deed the good news of God's divine love that's available here and now to everyone, even to the worst of sinners. Now, over the next 5 to 6 weeks, I would like to explore the centrality and the importance of love in what Gary Chapman calls the 5 languages of love. He writes that each of us, through our conditioning and our particular personality types, give and receive love in at least 5 different ways. And he calls these love languages. Very briefly, these love languages include the following: words of affirmation, physical touch, quality time, acts of service, and the giving and receiving of gifts. Gary Chapman suggests that for each of us, one of these love languages will be the primary way in which we give and receive love, although all of us will have at least one other secondary language of love. Our primary language of love is our natural way of receiving and showing love. And we usually learn this language very early on in our families as we grow up. Secondary love languages are generally secondary learned patterns of expressing love that is not quite so natural. And it may be that 2 of these languages of love may come more naturally to us, and other languages of love need to be learned. Gary Chapman's theory of the 5 languages of love means that other people may not share our primary love language, which means that sometimes love can be lost in translation. One of the difficulties of speaking different languages is that people don't always understand one another. And so it is with the 5 languages of love. If one person's primary language of love is, for example, expressed through physical touch, and another person's primary language of love is the giving of gifts, they may end up talking past each other. The person who receives the gift may not fully recognize the gift as the profound act of love that it is, because what they really want and possibly need is just a hug. But for another person, a hug might be interpreted as a bit of an invasion of their personal space, and therefore may not realize that for someone else, this is their primary expression of love. One of the ways that we can grow as human beings is firstly to recognize what our own language of love is. And secondly, for us to recognize that not all people have the same primary language of love as us. This growing awareness of ourselves and others can help to facilitate greater understanding and in the process help us to grow in our love for others. Learning another person's language is in fact a great act of love. English speakers around the world have unfortunately not been very good at learning the languages of other people. In South Africa, for example, generally English speakers are the least able to speak other people's languages. And most English speakers would expect other people to speak English rather than the other way around. Now, when I ministered in African townships for 5 years in my early ministry in South Africa, I made a point of doing my best to learn at least a little bit of an African language. In fact, it was more than one. I wasn't as successful as I'd hoped, but I could see that these fumbling attempts to speak their language were actually received very warmly as acts of love. And so it is that if we wish to nurture loving relationships with others, we all need in some way to recognize firstly that other people's primary language of love may not be the same as my own. And as an act of love towards them, it might mean being willing to acknowledge and learn someone else's language of love. And so if I'm not used to giving gifts as an expression of love, it might be that I might need to learn to give gifts as a way of affirming someone else's love language. If I want to show love to someone whose primary love language is words of affirmation, if I'm to love them for who they are, then I will need to learn to use words of affirmation in my dealings with them as well. And so may God bless us over the next few weeks as we explore these 5 languages of love, perhaps learning a little more about ourselves and a little more about others, and in the process, hopefully learning a little more of God's love for each of us and God's way of love expressed in the life of Jesus, who in many ways, as we read the gospel stories, comes across as someone who was multilingual, speaking fluently all 5 languages of love. Amen.